In 1839, a British vessel sailed in the Pearl River Delta with a rather unexpected cargo. It wasn't tea, silk, or spices. Rather, it transported opium, cultivated in India, refined under the British Crown, and exported in barrels to China. What is notable is that it succeeded, and succeeded quite well. During that period, Britain was unable to balance its trade in China. Chinese brought with them a silk and porcelain and tea, which the West needed very much. Britain had wool and produced cloth, which China was not really interested in. Britain produced a different type of customer rather than something that China desired. This was typical, but with a twist. The product was a narcotic. The market, a big civilization of 400 million people, and the sales force, the Royal Navy. This is how the issue of addiction became an instrument of economic policy to an empire. It illuminates on money, power, and the extreme action taken by governments. Then, and more so now, when they experience an unfriendly trade balance. By mid-1700s, Britain had created a great desire of Chinese goods. Tea has ceased to be a luxury and was now a national habit. As early as 1800, imports of tea alone used to be around 23 million pounds annually. To those porcelains, silk, and lacquer, the British taste in Chinese commodities appeared to be insatiable, but China did not desire British products. The Qing emperor went to an extent of informing King George III that China was rich and had no need of external products. This did not amount to arrogance, but a correct perception of their self-sufficiency. In the industrial perspective of Britain, it was like going to a fine potlatch, without anything worthy in your hands. This caused silver to be draining out of Britain and into China. The East India Company, the business entity that propelled British imperialism, was hemorrhaging between the years 1760 and 1780. It was not a mere business, but it had an army, a navy, and courts. It controlled the trading of almost half the world at the time, and at its peak, controlled more than 200 million people. Yet, it was going broke. It needed to change, and it would come out of the poppy fields of Bengal. The system that emerged was coldly efficient. First, the East India Company gained exclusive control over opium production in Bengal. Farmers were forced to grow poppies at fixed low prices and were not allowed to sell anywhere else. The company then processed the opium into standard 140-pound chests, auctioning them to British merchants in Calcutta. Second, these merchants would sail to the Chinese coast and anchor just outside Chinese jurisdiction. Chinese smugglers took over distribution inland, allowing the British government plausible deniability. Officially, the Crown wasn't selling drugs, its private contractors were. In legal terms, this separation made all the difference. This arrangement works much like modern holding companies. Profits rise, subsidiaries take the blame, and the parent company stays shielded. Third, Chinese buyers paid for the opium with silver, which then flowed back to British merchants to purchase tea and silk. That tea entered Britain, was sold, and taxed by the Crown. What you see here is a self-contained financial loop. Opium wasn't simply profitable. It supplied the currency necessary to keep the British-China trade running. It acted basically as a reserve currency for the empire's trade balance. The so-called drug trade wasn't a side business. It was the backbone of the operation. If you were a London merchant in 1802, pouring your morning tea, you'd be unknowingly part of this chain. The silver that bought your tea came from a Chinese addict trading for opium grown by a farmer in Bengal, paid by a company accountable to London shareholders. The whole connection was hidden, intentionally so. By the 1830s, opium revenue made up 15 to 20% of the British Indian government's income. This was no small part of their economy. It was built into the system. On the other side, by 1835, approximately 12 million Chinese people were addicted. The Qing government wasn't watching its silver disappear because their economy was failing. It was because the population was exchanging silver for a drug controlled by foreigners. The trade deficit Britain once suffered was reversed, shifted to China instead. This wasn't a vanishing problem. It was repackaged and exported. That approach, surprisingly, still echoes in modern economic strategies. In 1839, Lin Zexu, an imperial official, decided to act. He wasn't a radical, but a pragmatist, faced with seeing his country eroded, both financially and socially, by a foreign-controlled supply network. He wrote directly to Queen Victoria, appealing to her as a moral sovereign to end the trade. No response came, so Lin took matters into his own hands. Over 3 weeks, in the summer of 1839, he confiscated and publicly destroyed more than 1,400 tons of British opium, 20,000 chests, or about $600 million in today's money. The opium was dissolved in salt water and burned. It was arguably the most dramatic interruption of supply ever recorded. The British reaction made it clear that this conflict wasn't only about trade, it was about who held control. Britain declared war not over land or religion, but the right to sell narcotics to another country, despite its laws forbidding it. The First Opium War ended in 1842 with China ceding Hong Kong, opening ports to British trade and paying a heavy financial penalty. When conflict flared up again in 1856, the Second Opium War followed, with a similar result. China lost, and the opium trade was legalized. The Qing Empire was left broken. The twin blows of financial losses and widespread addiction shook institutions that had stood for centuries. Eventually, the dynasty collapsed in 1912, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule. The Qing's fall wasn't just military defeat, it was a collapse across economic, social, and psychological fronts, hastened by a deliberate financial assault lasting decades. Politically, the effects lasted for generations. From China's First Opium War through to 1949's founding of the People's Republic, this period is known as the Century of Humiliation. This isn't distant history in China, it's taught, referenced in policy, and shapes every discussion on economic sovereignty. When today's leaders talk about self-reliance or controlling trade, this legacy lies beneath their words. From a financial view, the opium trade showed something economists still debate. Unresolved trade imbalances tend to breed political conflict. Britain's silver deficit led to desperate solutions, profitable and scalable, yet devastating for those on the receiving end. So, 200 years ago, the answer to a trade deficit was much like it sometimes is now: control an addictive commodity and let human nature drive demand. The East India Company itself was dissolved by 1874 after mismanagement helped spark the Indian Rebellion of 1857. A company built on drug profits became too corrupt and dangerous, even for the British government that created it. The takeaway? When a corporation outlives its usefulness to government, it gets nationalized. When a government outlives its usefulness to its people, it's replaced. These lessons, forged in the 1800s, remain relevant today. The opium trade isn't a tale of villains, but a story about systems, how they operate when their internal logic ignores external harm. The company directors, colonial officials, and ministers weren't acting wildly. They faced a real problem. The silver drain was real. The deficit was real. Their solution was effective and profitable. The destruction of a civilization was just collateral damage in the empire's books. That's the hard truth. The most disastrous economic choices rarely look catastrophic to those making them. They seem like the right plan, a growth strategy, even genius, until the whole house of cards starts to fall. For anyone thinking about money and power today, the question isn't whether something like this could happen again. The real question is, what form would it take? And can you spot it before the system starts to unravel? If tools like manufactured dependence, hidden supply chains, and financial tricks disguised as trade were used now, what sector do you think they'd be hidden in? Share your thoughts below. There are no wrong answers here. The best discussions start with questions like this. And if this story changed how you see empire and money, subscribe. Every week, we explore the history of wealth that often goes untold in textbooks. See you next time.